The blizzard hit the Montana mountains like a living beast, devouring sound and sight. Beneath the white chaos, a police cruiser lay overturned, its red lights flashing weakly through the storm. Mason Hale saw it first from his cabin window. Just a pulse of color in a sea of snow. The former Navy SEAL grabbed his coat before reason could stop him. His German shepherd Marvel, already at the door, barking into the wind, they fought through the freezing darkness until the wreck came. Into view, smoke and fire, licking at the edges of the steel. Inside, a woman in uniform hung, limp and still. Mason tore the door open, pulling her free, seconds before the car exploded. He didn't yet know who she was, or that saving her would drag him back into a world of betrayal and blood he thought he'd left behind forever. We invite you to support us by subscribing to the channel. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana mountains, driving snow through the endless pines until every sound but its own was buried beneath white silence. The storm had rolled in before sundown, and by nightfall, the forest looked like a world erased. Inside a lone wooden cabin tucked between frozen firs, Mason Hale sat beside the dim glow of a dying fire, running a whetstone slowly along the edge of a hunting knife. The rhythmic scrape was the only heartbeat in that quiet room. Mason was a man carved by war and solitude, tall, broad-shouldered, and slightly stooped, as though the weight of his past still rode on his back. His face bore the rough geography of endurance. Deep lines at the corners of his eyes, a trimmed beard streaked with gray, and a thin scar tracing down his right cheek, a relic from a night in Kandahar that had taken more than blood. His dark hair, once neatly cropped to military precision, now hung unruly over a brow that rarely knew rest. He had been a Navy SEAL, one of the best, until the day the mission went wrong and the sea swallowed his brothers. Since then, he had lived as though in penance in the wild, away from people, away from noise, and perhaps away from forgiveness. His only companion was Marvel, a large German shepherd, 6 years old, muscles lean beneath a thick coat of sable and ash-gray fur. The dog's amber eyes glimmered with intelligence and something almost human, an old sorrow Mason never quite understood. Marvel was loyal but quiet, rarely barking unless he sensed danger. They shared an unspoken bond, two soldiers of different species, both scarred by things no one else could see. Mason stood and fed another log to the fire, watching the flames bite through the bark. The smell of pine smoke filled the small cabin, a single room with rough-hewn walls, a battered table, a cot in the corner, and a photo of a SEAL unit half faded with time. He sometimes caught himself staring at that picture longer than he meant to, counting faces that would never age. Outside, the storm screamed louder. The wind slammed against the windows, and snow hissed across the panes like sandpaper. Mason checked the latch on the door, more out of habit than worry. "Hell of a night," he muttered, glancing at Marvel. The dog lifted his head, ears twitching. Mason gave a faint smile, the closest thing to laughter his face had known in weeks. "Guess it's just us again, buddy." But Marvel didn't relax. His ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Mason froze. The dog rarely made that sound unless something was wrong. A heartbeat later, Marvel barked sharp, insistent, then darted toward the door. "What is it?" Mason called, grabbing his parka and flashlight. The dog barked again, pawing at the door. Mason pulled it open, and the wind punched through the room like a living thing, scattering embers from the hearth. Snow whipped into his face, blinding and freezing. Marvel bounded ahead into the white fury, leaving deep prints that vanished almost instantly. "Marvel!" Mason shouted, but the storm swallowed his voice. He followed anyway, his boots crunching through drifts, breath burning in his chest. The flashlight beam danced across a landscape of ghost snow-laden trees, skeletal branches, endless white. Then, through the blur of wind, a flash of red light flickered low in the valley below. He moved closer, heart pounding. It wasn't a reflection, it was a vehicle, its lights half buried under snow. As Mason approached, he saw the blue and red glint of a police cruiser, overturned near a line of rocks. The engine was dead, but the hazard lights blinked weakly, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. "Jesus!" Mason whispered, slipping down the slope. The smell of gasoline mingled with the cold air. Marvel was already there, scratching frantically at the passenger side door. Mason dropped to his knees beside him, shining the flashlight inside. A woman, a police officer, hung unconscious from her seatbelt, blood staining her temple. Steam curled from the crushed hood. The front was crumpled, the windshield cracked like spiderwebs. "Hang on," he muttered. Mason braced his shoulder and yanked at the door handle. It didn't budge. He grabbed the butt of his hunting knife and smashed the window. Shards of glass fell like ice. He reached in, fingers numb, and sliced through the belt restraining her. She slumped forward into his arms, limp and cold. Her uniform was torn, one sleeve dark with blood. She was young, late 20s, maybe with pale skin drained of color and dark hair matted by snow. There was something determined even in her unconscious face, the kind of strength that had not yet learned to give up. The hiss of leaking fuel pulled Mason back to the moment. He looked at the spreading puddle beneath the car, the sparks flickering near the engine. "Time to move," he growled. Lifting her into his arms, he turned uphill. Marvel barked sharply, circling ahead through the storm, guiding the way home. Halfway up the slope, the world behind them erupted in a muffled explosion, a dull thunder swallowed by snow. Heat flashed against Mason's back, then vanished as quickly as it came. He didn't look back. Step after step, he carried her through the storm until the cabin lights appeared dim, golden, a fragile promise against the dark. Inside, he laid her on the rug near the fireplace, her breath shallow, lips bluish from cold. Mason wrapped her in blankets, rubbed warmth into her hands. Marvel settled nearby, panting softly, eyes fixed on her face as if guarding something precious. "Stay with me," Mason murmured, checking her pulse. It was faint, but steady. The firelight flickered over them, the soldier, the stranger, and the dog, three beings caught in the same storm for reasons none of them yet understood. Outside, the wind howled on, relentless. Inside, beneath the fragile warmth of a cabin in the snow, a story neither of them expected had already begun. When Nora Vance opened her eyes, the world was washed in amber light and the faint crackle of burning wood. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and melted snow. For a long moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Only the flash of headlights, the screech of twisting metal, and then white silence. Her body ached everywhere, as though she had been buried beneath the storm itself. She tried to sit up, but a firm hand steadied her shoulder. "Easy," said a deep voice. "You're safe. The crash is over." The man standing before her looked like someone carved from the very timber of the cabin. Mason Hale, though she didn't yet know his name, had the rough, solid build of a man who'd worked too long in the cold. His beard was flecked with gray, his eyes a pale blue that reflected both weariness and calm control. The heavy parka hanging on the chair beside him was lined with old military patches, and his stance spoke of discipline even in stillness. He didn't move nervously or talk much. His every action seemed deliberate, measured, almost rehearsed, like someone who had spent years surviving rather than living. "I found you down the slope," he said quietly. "Your car exploded a few minutes later. You were lucky." Nora's throat burned when she tried to speak. "The radio?" "Destroyed," he replied. "And the roads are gone. We're cut off till the storm settles." Her gaze drifted past him and froze. Near the fire lay a German shepherd, large and watchful, his fur shining gold and gray in the light. The dog's amber eyes followed her every movement. There was something hauntingly familiar in their depth, intelligence, and sorrow intertwined. Mason noticed her stare. "That's Marvel," he said simply. "He's been restless since the storm started. Guess he knew you were out there." Marvel tilted his head, then rose and padded toward her with slow, cautious steps. Nora hesitated, half raising a hand, and the dog sat in front of her, gaze unwavering. When her fingers brushed his chest, she felt a faint ridge under the fur, a small, crescent-shaped scar just below the collar line. The room seemed to tilt. Her breath caught. "No," she whispered, voice trembling. "Shadow?" The name slipped from her like an exhale she'd been holding for a year. The dog's ears perked. He whined softly. The sound cracked something inside her. Tears stung her eyes. Mason frowned, confusion cutting through his calm. "You know him?" Nora wiped her eyes and forced herself to speak. "He belonged to my husband, Detective Ryan Vance. They were partners, K-9 unit. There was an explosion during a raid last year. They said Shadow died that night." Her voice faltered. "But he didn't, did he?" Marvel or Shadow pressed his head gently against her knee, as if to answer for both of them. Mason looked down at the dog, realization dawning. "When I found him, he was half dead in the forest thin, bleeding, terrified of sirens. No tags, no chip that worked. I didn't know." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I gave him a second name." For a moment, silence filled the cabin. The wind moaned outside like a restless spirit. Nora's tears slowed. "You saved him," she said softly. Mason gave a small shrug. "He's the one who saved me." His tone carried a heaviness she didn't question not yet. She tried to stand, but pain shot through her leg. Mason moved instinctively to help, his hand strong under her elbow. Up close, she could see the faint tremor that passed through him whenever he touched another person, as if kindness was a muscle he hadn't used in years. "I need to contact the FBI," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "There's something I have to deliver. Evidence. People died for it." "What kind of evidence?" Mason asked, though he already knew the tone of someone haunted by duty. She met his eyes, fierce now, determined despite the weakness in her body. "A data drive. Files from an arms trafficking ring. My husband was investigating it when he was killed. I stole the real copy before they burned the case. Xavier Boone, the chief of police, he's in on it. He works with them." Mason's jaw tightened. The name carried the weight of corruption he had heard too many times in war zones where men with badges hid behind power. "They'll come for it," Nora continued. "They already tried. That's why I ran. I was heading for Helena to meet an FBI contact when the storm hit me." She glanced toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass like a living wall. "If they were tracking me, they'll find the crash soon." Mason said nothing. He walked to the window, peered into the darkness, then checked the rifle leaning against the wall. His movements were calm, but inside, his mind was already turning, calculating distances, strategies, exits. The instincts of a SEAL never left. "You'll stay here till it's safe," he said at last. "The storm's covering everything for now. That'll buy us some time." "I can't just hide," she protested. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "You can't fight a dozen men in a blizzard either." Marvel barked once sharp, alert, then stared toward the door. Mason's gaze followed. In the distance, faint and intermittent, a red pulse flickered against the snow, the dying signal light of Nora's cruiser. Neither of them spoke. Both knew what it meant. Outside, the storm no longer sounded empty. It had footsteps in it now. By dawn, the storm had slowed to a whisper. The forest outside was still, heavy with new snow that blanketed every path leading down the mountain. Mason Hale stood at the window, a mug of coffee in one hand, the rifle leaning against the wall beside him. His breath fogged the glass as he watched the pale horizon slowly brighten. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was the kind that came before trouble. He'd lived through enough ambushes to recognize the pattern. Silence meant movement elsewhere. Behind him, the cabin was warm but tense. Nora Vance, her arm wrapped in a sling from the bruised shoulder she'd earned during the crash, sat at the table, spreading a stack of papers from her coat pocket, handwritten notes, half-burned photos, and one small silver flash drive sealed in plastic. The exhaustion in her face hadn't dulled the sharpness of her eyes. She looked like someone who had lived too long between duty and grief, strong-jawed, pale from sleepless nights, and driven by something she couldn't put down. Mason turned back toward her. "You're sure this drive's all they need?" "It's everything," she said flatly. "Transaction logs, police IDs, offshore routes. Boone sold protection to arms dealers for years. My husband found it out too late." She hesitated before continuing. "They called it an accident, Mason, but it was a setup. He was killed because he got too close." Marvel lay stretched beside the door, his fur bristling slightly, head resting on his paws but eyes alert. Every few minutes, his ears twitched, reacting to something distant that neither human could hear. Mason noticed. "He doesn't rest easy," he murmured. "He never did," Nora replied. "Even when Ryan was alive, that dog could sense danger before anyone else, like he could smell fear itself." Outside, a faint crack echoed through the still air. Mason's instincts flared. He crossed to the window, rifle in hand, and scanned the tree line. Nothing. All moved. Yet he saw it, a thin column of smoke, faint but wrong. Not from his chimney. Someone was there. He set the mug down quietly. "You should pack what you need. Don't make noise." Nora froze, the flash drive still in her hand. "They found us, didn't they?" Mason didn't answer. He slipped on his parka, opened a drawer under the counter, and pulled out a small case of military-grade binoculars, scratched but functional. He stepped outside onto the porch, snow crunching under his boots. The cold hit him like a blade. Marvel followed, muscles tense beneath his thick coat. Through the binoculars, Mason saw them. Tracks, 2 sets, maybe 3, cutting through the white from the southern ridge. Not locals. The stride was too long, too heavy, and the way they moved told him they were trained. One figure, tall, broad, dressed in dark winter gear, carried a scoped rifle slung across his back. Another smaller figure moved ahead, scanning the path with a metal detector. These weren't hunters. They were the kind of men who made sure their footprints led only one way. Mason went back inside. 2, maybe 3, he said quietly. "They're pros." Nora's breath hitched. Boone's men. Mason started moving, closing shutters, checking ammunition, pulling an old wooden chest from under the bed. Inside were tools from another life, flash grenades, tripwire, and a rusted combat knife, engraved with a SEAL emblem. His movements were mechanical, detached, yet beneath that discipline was something stirring purpose. It had been years since he'd felt that pulse of readiness, the sharp clarity that came when survival depended on him. While he worked, Nora stood watching him. "You're not just some hermit," she said. "Who are you? Really?" He didn't look up. "Someone who got tired of watching good people die for bad ones," Marvel barked suddenly, sharp and low, tail stiff. Mason turned. The dog faced the window, growling. A glint of light flashed outside metal catching morning sun. "Sniper scope! Down!" Mason shouted. He grabbed Nora by the arm, pulling her to the floor as the window shattered, glass exploding across the room. A bullet buried itself in the log wall behind them. Marvel leapt up, barking furiously. Mason crawled toward the corner, eyes scanning the tree line through the shattered window. He saw movement, the tall figure with the rifle adjusting position. Without hesitation, Mason returned fire. The echo cracked through the mountains like thunder. The shot drove the attacker back into cover. Mason turned to Nora. "They'll test the perimeter before coming closer. We've got a few hours, maybe less." Nora swallowed hard but steadied herself. "Then, we make it count." They worked in silence. Mason showed her how to reload the rifle, where to crouch behind the fireplace's stone base. Nora's hands shook at first, then steadied as repetition replaced fear. Marvel followed. Mason out the back door, while he strung wire and set traps along the slope. A small line of grenades, buried just deep enough under snow to surprise anyone who followed tracks too closely. When he came back, Nora was staring at the photograph above his bed, a younger Mason in uniform beside a team of SEALs, all smiling, all alive. "You lost them," she said quietly. He nodded once. "Most of them. And the ones who lived stopped knowing how to." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying faint voices, men shouting orders. Marvel growled low, every muscle ready to spring. Mason checked his watch, the rhythm of his breathing slowing to that familiar calm before violence. He looked at Nora. "When the wind stops," he said, "they'll move. That's when it starts." Nora met his eyes. "Then we'll be ready." Marvel shifted beside them, tail rigid, gaze fixed on the door. The blizzard was returning, but this time it wasn't the storm they feared. The night fell like a curtain of iron. The wind had died, but the forest was too still, that unnatural stillness that always came before men tried to kill one another. The moon was veiled by drifting clouds, and the world outside the cabin had turned to silver and shadow. Mason Hale crouched beside the window, peering through the narrow slit between the boards. His breath formed a faint mist that hung in the air like a ghost. Far down the slope, lights flared. 3 black vehicles crawled up the icy trail, engines growling low, tires grinding against frozen ground. Mason counted silhouettes, 4 in each car, at least a dozen in total. He felt his heartbeat slow, not from fear, but from focus. For the first time in years, he was back where he belonged, in the terrible clarity of survival. Inside, Nora was kneeling by the stone fireplace, clutching the small flash drive in her hand. The bandage on her shoulder had darkened with blood again, but she refused to rest. Her pale face was lit by the trembling glow of the fire. There was a steadiness in her eyes now, not the frantic panic of the day before, but something colder, honed by grief and purpose. She looked up at Mason. "They're coming for the drive," she said. "They won't leave with it," he replied simply. Then he called, "Basement, now." She hesitated. "And you?" "I'll buy us time." Before she could argue, Marvel let out a sharp bark and darted to the back door. His fur bristled, nose high, sensing movement where the human eye saw only darkness. The dog's instincts were razor-sharp, every muscle alive with anticipation. Mason grabbed his rifle and a handful of shells. "Go, Nora. Take the drive. Keep it safe. That's an order." The tone wasn't angry. It was the steady voice of a man who'd given orders in worse places and lost too many when they weren't followed. Reluctantly, Nora moved toward the trapdoor, pulling it open. The basement was narrow, lined with old crates and tools. She descended, clutching both the pistol Mason had given her and the flash drive pressed against her chest. Marvel stayed behind, watching her disappear before turning back to Mason, waiting for the next command. The first gunshot cracked through the night like lightning. A bullet punched through the upper wall, spraying splinters across the room. Mason dropped to one knee and returned fire through the window slit. 1, 2, 3 shots, in measured rhythm. A scream echoed faintly from outside. Then, silence. The attackers spread out, headlights cutting arcs across the trees. Mason caught glimpses of them, dark shapes moving low, trained, coordinated. One man carried a thermal scope, sweeping the area. Another held what looked like a grenade launcher, slung casually across his shoulder. Among them, Mason recognized one figure immediately, Lucas Dreyer, a name whispered in his past life. Dreyer had once served as a private contractor in Iraq, infamous for his ruthlessness. A tall, rangy man with close-cropped blonde hair and a jagged scar down his chin, Lucas was the kind who smiled while killing. His black parka and military vest gleamed with fresh snow, and his gray eyes burned with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Cabin's got 2 inside," Lucas's voice rasped over the wind. "Make it quick." Mason took position behind the sofa, using it as partial cover. He waited until he saw a muzzle flash outside, then squeezed off 2 rounds. The front window exploded, the smell of gunpowder mixing with pine smoke. A shadow stumbled, then fell still. From the rear, another group moved in. Marvel caught the scent first, his ears flattened, growl deepening to a snarl. Before Mason could turn, the back door burst open and a masked man charged in. Marvel lunged, teeth flashing, knocking the intruder off balance. The man screamed as the dog tore into his arm, the rifle clattering across the floor. Mason pivoted, fired once the body went limp. Marvel stood over it, panting, blood flecked against his muzzle. "Good boy," Mason whispered, reloading fast. But more were coming. Downstairs, Nora heard the chaos above. Her hands trembled as she checked the pistol's magazine. The basement walls shook with the concussive roar of grenades outside. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself a habit from childhood, half prayer, half command. "Stay alive, Ryan. Stay with me." Then she forced herself up the stairs. When she emerged, smoke filled the cabin, thick and gray. Mason was by the front door, taking cover behind the overturned table. The fire from the hearth had spread, licking the rug with orange fingers. "Get back!" he shouted, but Nora ignored him. A dark shape crawled toward the window. She aimed, breath steady, and fired once. The figure fell backward into the snow. Mason turned to look at her surprise, and pride mingled in one flicker of expression. Outside, Lucas shouted orders. "Light it up! Burn the place!" His men hurled Molotovs through the broken windows. Flames erupted instantly, roaring up the log walls. Mason felt the heat surge across his skin. He grabbed Nora's arm. "We move now." He shoved open the back door, letting the freezing air rush in. Marvel bounded through first, leading them into the tree line. Behind them, the cabin blazed like a beacon in the dark. They made it 30 yards before Mason dropped to one knee, turned, and fired his last round. The bullet found Lucas in the shoulder, spinning him around. The mercenary's snarl echoed through the forest as Mason grabbed Nora's hand and pulled her deeper into the shadows. The fire devoured the cabin, sparks swirling into the sky like dying stars. Mason looked back once his home, his solitude, his refuge gone in flames. He turned to Nora. "We're alive," he said, voice low but sure. "That's what matters. But this isn't over." Marvel stood between them, tail rigid, eyes reflecting the firelight, not fear, but promise. The world smelled of ash and thawing pine when the first light crept across the Montana ridgeline. Smoke still lingered faintly in the trees where Mason's cabin had stood, now nothing but a blackened skeleton among the snow. The air was bitter, but clean, the kind that tasted like a second chance. Mason Hale stood at the edge of the clearing, shoulders heavy beneath his worn parka, the rifle still slung across his back. His eyes were red from smoke and sleeplessness, but they were steady, focused on the horizon where the faint whir of rotors grew louder. The FBI helicopter appeared like a dark hawk above the valley, slicing through the dawn. It descended slowly, whipping up snow in a whirlwind of white. 2 agents stepped out as the blades slowed a man and a woman. The man, Agent Cole Turner, looked to be in his mid-40s, tall and angular, with short-cropped black hair and a neat beard streaked with silver. His eyes were sharp, assessing everything with quiet efficiency. There was something disciplined in the way he moved, the posture of a man who had seen too many operations go sideways and had survived them by sheer caution. The faint burn scar across his left wrist hinted at a past explosion he didn't care to discuss. Beside him was Agent Dana Ruiz, younger, perhaps in her early 30s, with olive skin, almond-shaped eyes, and a sleek braid that trailed down the back of her heavy coat. Her movements were quicker, more intuitive. She spoke little, but her gaze softened slightly when it fell upon Nora, standing nearby. Nora looked different now. The blood and grime were gone, replaced by calm exhaustion. Her dark hair was tied loosely, a few strands framing a face that seemed older than it had 2 days ago. Her shoulder was wrapped neatly in a new bandage, and the flash drive, the evidence that had cost so much, hung in a small, waterproof case around her neck. Mason approached as the agents disembarked, Marvel trotting at his side. The dog's fur was singed at the tips from the night's fire, but his stance was proud. Turner greeted them with a curt nod. "You must be Hale," he said, his tone professional but not cold. "We got your signal. The evidence?" Nora stepped forward, voice firm, though tired. "Here. Everything Boone covered up: transaction logs, shipment routes, names, enough to bury them all." Ruiz took the drive gently, sliding it into a padded case. "We've been chasing Boone's network for 3 years," she said quietly. "You just handed us the proof to end it." Turner turned toward Mason. "You handled yourself well. Most civilians wouldn't have lasted through what you just faced." Mason gave a small shrug. "Wasn't my first storm." Ruiz glanced at Marvel, who was sniffing the snow around her boots. "And this one?" "His name's Marvel," Mason said. "But that's not the name he started with." He looked at Nora, and for the first time since the crash, she smiled, small, sad, but real. Turner exchanged a look with Ruiz before speaking again. "We'll take you both to Helena for debriefing. After that, we'll see about getting you somewhere safe. Boone's people will scatter once they realize he's gone, but for now, you're still targets." Nora's gaze drifted to the tree line, where the smoke had faded into the pale blue of morning. "I'm done running," she said softly. "I just want this to mean something." Turner nodded. "It already does." He motioned to the helicopter. "Let's go home." Marvel barked once, the sound echoing across the mountains. Mason knelt beside him, his gloved hand resting on the dog's neck. "You hear that, buddy? Home," he whispered. Months passed. The snow melted, revealing wild grass and the charred outline where the cabin once stood. Mason rebuilt it slowly by hand, plank by plank, using lumber hauled up from the nearest town. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. The seasons turned, and spring returned with quiet mercy. The sun rose earlier now, casting gold through the valley. Mason fixed the last board on the fence when he heard laughter behind him. Nora was standing by the porch, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Her arm had healed well, though the scar still traced pale against her skin. She wore a flannel shirt and jeans, her badge gone, her weapon locked away. Marvel lay sprawled beneath the steps, his head resting on his paws. The dog's fur gleamed again, the faint scar on his chest barely visible. He had gained weight, and though he was still alert, he now spent his days napping under the sun, guarding nothing more dangerous than peace. Nora handed Mason a mug. "Fence looks straight," she said. Mason took it with a faint grin. "That's because you weren't helping. Someone had to make the coffee." They stood in silence for a while, watching the river thaw in the distance. The world had gone still again, but not the kind of stillness born of fear. This was the kind of quiet that came after survival. Finally, Nora broke it. "Do you ever think," she began, "that maybe it wasn't just luck? Us meeting, I mean? Maybe it was supposed to happen?" Mason looked at her, eyes soft but unreadable. "No," he said quietly. "I think Ryan sent him." He nodded toward Marvel, who lifted his head at the sound of his name. "Dogs remember what we can't. Maybe he was just finishing what your husband started." Nora's eyes glistened, but she smiled. "Then I guess he did his job." Marvel barked once, the sound bright and clean. The morning sun spilled across the valley, melting the last traces of winter. Mason raised his mug slightly, as if toasting something unseen. "To second chances," he said. Nora echoed him. "And to justice." The dog barked again, tail thumping softly against the porch, as though agreeing with both. Above them, a hawk circled lazily against the clear blue sky, and the mountains stood silent once more, not as witnesses to war, but as keepers of peace. Sometimes miracles are not loud or dramatic. They come quietly, in moments when all seems lost, like dawn breaking after a long night. Mason, Nora, and Marvel remind us that even in the darkest winter, God's light can still find its way through the storm. Their survival was not just luck. It was grace proof that when we act with courage, faith, and compassion, we become part of His plan. In our everyday lives, we often walk through our own storms, fear, loss, doubt. But every act of kindness, every small choice to protect or forgive, is a spark of divine mercy working through us. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the miracles hidden in your own life. Share this story, leave a comment about what faith and redemption mean to you, and subscribe for more tales of hope and courage. May God bless you, watch over your loved ones, and guide you through every storm until your own dawn arrives.